Hi everybody, it's Grandad here again. I'm in my little workshop and I thought I'd tell you another little tale which my family got involved in. Now I mentioned on my previous videos that I'm not really very keen on people who commit murder, and murder's a thing that not really interests me. But because I was talking about Hilda Morrill and a murder of her back in the day, it got me thinking about another murder. And this one was a little bit closer to home because my brother was actually involved in this murder. Not that he was involved in the murder itself, of course. He was just involved in the trial. Now, it turns out that there was a young chap in his 20s who lived in Shrewsbury, and his name was George Riley. And now George lived in Westlands Road, which obviously you don't know where that is, but it's a little area of Shrewsbury where I used to live. And in England over here, and in the county of Shropshire. And Westlands Road wasn't more than, I don't know, 300 yards, I suppose. Very close to where I used to live on Mitten Oak Road. This was just another little area just off Mitten Oak Road called Westlands Road. And George Riley used to live there. Now, George Riley was back in the day, back in the 60s, this is the early 60s I'm talking about, is 1960s, was a local lad, and he was a bit of a lad about town, as you might imagine. It was back in the day when they had teddy boys and all that sort of thing, and I must admit he was a bit of a roughhouse in some respects, but during the day he worked as a butcher, and he was trained, and he actually worked at Shrewsbury Abattoir, where he was training to be a butcher, so blood and things wouldn't have bothered him, I suppose, in that sort of sense. So I don't know whether that would go any better for him or not, but he certainly was well used to, blood and stuff. That wouldn't upset him, I wouldn't think, seeing that. But not that that makes any difference to it, but, just to throw that in there. So he was a trainee butcher. Now, apparently, I didn't know, I was too young at the time, but I didn't know him very well, but my brother did, and he was about the same age as him. And so he knew George Riley simply because he lived close by. And people who knew George when he was out and about said that he was a perfect gentleman. I mean, he'd give up his seat on a bus for ladies and all that sort of thing, and he was very polite. And his family were very strict. I mean, his father was, an up and standing man, and people in the community, and there was no trouble with him. And he wasn't any trouble so long as he was sober. Now, obviously, being a young man, he'd go out drinking with his mates, and not far from where we lived, there was an army barracks. Now, when you get an army barracks, you get a lot of soldiers, or as we used to call them back in the day, squaddies. There'd be a lot of soldiers about the town and all that sort of thing. And for some reason, teddy boys and people who were out and about in the town, especially when they'd been drinking, they'd fall out with these squaddies, and there'd be fights. There was always fights in the streets late at night in Shrewsbury with teddy boys and the army people getting involved. And, there'd be a bit of a scuffle, there'd be a punch and a black eye and a bleeding nose maybe, and that would be the end of it. But so George, although he was, as I say, perhaps considered a bit of a roughhouse, he wasn't necessarily a violent person in himself during the day. It's only when he'd been drinking and he'd be out with his mates and he'd get a bit lardy and, that sort of thing, as lads do, showing off and all that sort of thing, and they'd fall out with these squaddies and they'd have fights. Now, the interesting thing about this particular murder was the person that was murdered was a lady by the name of Smith, I think her name was. I'm not quite sure what her name was. I might be able to see here while I'm reading up about it. It was in 1961, George Riley. I can't think, just see. Oh, she was Mary Smith, Adeline Mary Smith. And she was a 62-year-old widow. And she lived in Westlands Road, Shrewsbury, opposite the house where George lived. Now, George had a couple of brothers and that sort of thing. So the one was away in the army. I think he was a soldier and that sort of thing. Now, I've got a couple of pictures here I'd like to show you. Now, this first picture, because George was found guilty of this murder, which we're going to go on to in a minute. But this is a picture which I want to show of the Dana prison in Shrewsbury. Now, this is a local prison in Shrewsbury, which is unusual because usually when people go to prison, they go to another town away, miles away. But George, when he got arrested, he was taken to this prison, and this is the Dana. It's known as the Dana prison. And incidentally, George was the last person to be hung in Shrewsbury Jail, because soon after this incident occurred, they sort of repealed laws and things, and they condemned hanging. They don't hang people anymore. And so poor old George was unlucky in the sense that had it been another 12 months, maybe he wouldn't have been hung, because they'd have done away with hanging. And I've got another picture here of George himself, and there he is. And as I say, I'm not saying that he was a wonderful person. He wasn't. He was a bit of a roughhouse, a bit of a teddy boy. And you can see there, he looks a bit of a sullen sort of a guy, but he was only in his 20s, young man. And maybe this murder charge that he was charged with, and the fact that he hung, was perhaps not so safe a trial as you might think it might have been. Now, the newspapers picked up on it, and all this sort of thing, and when he came to trial. And strangely enough, they arrested George quite early on and took him to the police station and interviewed him. And strangely enough, after a long, arduous interview, which in those days they didn't, I wouldn't say the police were corrupt in any way. I can't prove that, so I can't say that, so that'd be libel. But, the police were at a way of questioning people, and he was only a young man, and they probably frightened him half to death in the prison, in the interview room there. And they say that he actually signed a confession to the murder. Now, maybe he did, I don't know. Maybe they beat it out of him, as they say. Whether that's true, I don't know. But certainly later on in his trial, he reclaimed that statement and claimed that he hadn't done it. And right till his dying day, he told his brother on the day that they executed him, when they visited him for the last time, that he hadn't actually done the murder at all. Now, there's one or two strange sort of things connected with it, which I must mention. And that is the fact I mentioned my brother. Now, strangely enough, my brother worked for a firm called Tanner and Southams. And they were a brewers in Shrewsbury, and he used to go out of an evening and go to parties and hotels and places where they had dances and that sort of thing, and he would serve behind the bar, selling drinks. Now, because he knew George, because he lived close by, and George Riley was somebody that my brother Ron knew, he knew George, and on that particular night, he'd actually seen George out and about, and he'd gone to the Rolls-Royce Club where my brother was working, and Ron had actually served him drinks during that evening. Now, George had said to have drunk 10 pints of beer before he even entered the Rolls-Royce Club. Now, 10 pints of beer takes a lot of drinking, and believe me, if you've had 10 pints of beer, you're not in your safe mind. Your mind is completely washed out. 10 pints of strong beer in those days would really, 8 pints, they say, is enough to make somebody completely drunk. But George had apparently drunk 10. And then he drank whiskey. He went into the club, and my brother actually went to the trial. He was one of the witnesses. And he testified that George had had 7 or 8 whiskies while he was in the Rolls-Royce Club. So he was rolling drunk. There's no doubt about that this man was, if he was standing at all, which I'm amazed that he was at 21 years old with that much alcohol in your system, was able to stand up. But certainly George was rolling drunk that night. And he said that he dropped him off at his home at about 1:30 in the morning. Now, his father, I think, had locked the doors, and George was unable to get into the house, I don't know. But they say that he actually slept in the coal house of the house. And maybe that would have been all right. If you'd been drunk, you wouldn't have cared where you slept. So that seems a bit strange. Now, to me, that somebody who was that drunk, and somehow they say he went to this house to rob the lady. Well, she had no money. Apparently, there was only about 4 shillings in a purse, which was left in her drawer. There was no robbery at all. But somebody said that, a witness said that they heard a scream in the middle of the night, on the particular night, and they seemed to think that this was this lady screaming, as George was presumably battering her. Now, another bit of evidence which was put forward in the trial was that George, that the murder scene was an absolute unbelievable mess. They say that the blood from this lady, which, as I say, I don't want to dwell on murders really and frightening people, but they say that this woman had been bashed so badly that the whole room was completely covered in blood. There wasn't a square inch of room on the walls. There was an impression almost of a human figure where you could see this lady had been bashed and bashed and bashed in the house and completely murdered, to the extent that anyone that was involved in that murder must have been absolutely covered in blood. Now, of course, maybe that wouldn't have bothered George, but it would have been on his clothes. There's no way he could have got rid of all that blood stains and bits and pieces and evidence. And of course, nowadays we've got DNA and all that sort of thing. Maybe they could have found out more evidence about it, and there wouldn't have been the doubt then that he'd actually committed the murder. Now, they did find some blood on George, but apparently it was a small amount of blood, which they say turned out to be his own blood, which he'd cut himself shaving in. It was on his shaving bowl. But the clothes that he wore that night apparently were examined, and no trace of blood was found on them, although there may have been blood on them because, as I said, he was a bit of a roughhouse, and he got involved in fights and nosebleeds and all sorts of things with soldiers in the town. So it wouldn't have surprised me to find bloodstains on George's clothes because, as I say, he did get involved in fights and things, and so he worked as a butcher. So the chances of blood being there, but whether it was the blood of Mary Smith, I don't know, or Miss Smith or whatever her name was, I don't know. But certainly there was great controversy over this murder. And over the years, there's been different programs made up about it, and they've looked into it, rough justice and all that sort of thing. And certainly today, obviously George wouldn't have been hung because hanging has been done away with. And even if he did the murder, which I'm not saying he didn't do it, I'm not saying at all that he didn't do it. I have no evidence to prove that he didn't do it, or whether he did do it. But if he did do it, he did it in a state of mind that was totally out of character for him, and totally out of his mind on drink and anger. Maybe he was taking out frustrations on being locked out of the house. Maybe he was taking out frustrations that obviously a young man felt in back in the day that were not very good, and therefore but to murder somebody in such a cold-blooded way, even if somebody, I mean, he was a respecter of ladies. Why would he murder a frail 62-year-old woman, just to take her money? I mean, it in some ways doesn't make sense. But certainly today, he wouldn't have been hung, and he would have got life sentence. He'd probably done 15 years. He'd probably be out and about now, and perhaps a model citizen, who knows. I'm in two ways. I sit on the fence. I'm a Libran, so I can see both sides of the argument, and therefore I sit on the fence a little bit when it comes to justice and things. I know that there are justice, and justice is not always served by doing the terrible thing. I mean, there's a lot of things that go on in the world which, when you look back on hindsight, sometimes murders have happened and they found that they actually hung an innocent man. Or maybe, as I say, when they're out of their minds on drink and drugs, maybe they're not as guilty as they ought to be if they do something in cold blood, as they say, when you've pre-calculated the murder and you committed a lot of murders, serial killers and things like that, where you've calculated it and you've thought about it and you've done it in a most cold-blooded way. Maybe people like that deserve to be punished to the utmost. But I mean, even today, somebody who's committed terrible crimes, they go to prison for life, but it doesn't mean to say they stay in there for all their life. Some do and some don't. And it's a very sort of strange sort of situation to be in. I mean, nobody has the right to take someone's life away in such a bad way. One life for another life. It's not necessarily, that's the old biblical terms, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. May not always be the best way. So I'm a bit sad about George. I think, the times that he lived were different. In that nowadays things are different, but there's a lot of crime about. There's a lot of knife crime and a lot of murders going on all the time. You read about it on the television, and it's very sad that we live in an age where people can't live together and try and be as happy as we can be. And it makes me very sad to think that people still commit murders, but when they're not in their right mind through drink and drugs, maybe they should not be forgiven, really, but not punished to the extent that we take their life as well. Give them a chance maybe to redeem themselves and to turn into better citizens. So, as I say, that's my little story that I thought I'd put up. It came to mind because my brother was involved in that murder, involved in the trial about that murder, and it was sort of interesting. You'll have to look it up on Wikipedia and look at the evidence and see for yourself what you think about George and the crimes that he sort of committed, if you like. If he committed a crime, I don't know. It's a very difficult problem to tangle with, and I'm not clever enough to fathom it out to know that's the rights and wrongs of it. But anyway, it's a little bit of a sad note today, so I thought I'd put it up as a video, just following up because it involved my family. And until next time, when I'll bring another tale, hopefully, of something that may be interesting to look at on the YouTube, please try and subscribe to my channel. I try to put interesting little things up. The winter's on me at the moment, and I'm not able to get out and do my experimenting. I am working on one or two things. My table here is covered in bits and pieces of electronics, which I'm working on, and doing a few experiments and science things that are coming up in the future. So I'm hoping to do that in not too long a time. But just at the moment, I'm not too well at the moment. I've got a slight problem that I've got a reoccurrence of an old enemy of mine. The old cancer's come back, and I suffer with a thing called myeloma, which is a nasty bone cancer. And I've been in remission for this last 20 odd years with myeloma bone cancer. And I've been battling it, but unfortunately it's come back a little bit now, and I'm having to do more treatment. And it's all right. I'm getting on okay. Don't worry about me. I'm doing all right. The treatment nowadays is a lot easier than what it was back in the day when I first had my treatment. It was horrendous then, and it was a terrible ordeal. And I spent a lot of time in hospital, and I was very, very ill. I lost my hair and all the things that happen when you get cancer, all the treatment, the chemotherapy and all that's not very nice. But I'm going through that at the moment, and I'm doing well. So, well, on that note, hopefully a happier note, that I'll survive and be able to do a few more videos for you and put a few more interesting things up. It's Grandad as usually. Put a like if you like it, and I'll be back again with another tall tale. So until then, it's Grandad wishing you all well, and bye-bye now. Bye-bye now.